US President Donald Trump really isn't very popular at the moment. His poll numbers have trended downwards basically since he took office, but have really cratered since the war in Iran took off. Nor do things look likely to improve anytime soon, given that the main gripe held by voters seems to be regarding inflation, which came in at basically a 3-year high of 3.8% last month, and is expected to rise further in the coming months. Nonetheless, Democrats have struggled to capitalize on the administration's historically unprecedented unpopularity, which has meant that the midterms have long looked like effectively a toss-up. However, the most recent polls suggest that this is finally starting to change. Not only is Trump plumbing new depths with his poll numbers, but it looks like it's finally starting to benefit the Democrats electorally. The next issue of our magazine is out very soon, with this issue focusing on all of the wars that Trump has been involved in during his second term, with each dot on the cover representing a different military intervention or strike. Inside, we run through each of the conflicts, from Venezuela and Iran to Yemen and Ecuador, as well as discussing what he's really doing. Pre-order your copy today at toolong.news. So, let's start by looking at Trump's personal approval ratings, because they really are pretty remarkably rubbish. At the time of writing, Nate Silver's aggregator has Trump's approval rating at a second-term low of just 38.5%, with his disapproval rating at an all-time high of 58.1%. This implies a net approval rating, that is the percentage of voters saying they approve of Trump minus the percentage saying they disapprove, of negative 19.6, a second-term low. Another well-regarded aggregator by data journalist G. Elliott Morris, using slightly different methodology, has Trump even lower, with his net approval sitting at negative 22. This is basically on par with the Economist tracker, which currently has Trump with a net approval of negative 21, again, well below his predecessors. It's hard to overstate quite how bad these numbers are. Not only are they the lowest numbers that Trump has seen so far in his second term, they're also well below where he was at this point in his first term, and make Trump probably the least popular president in modern US history. To put this in perspective, Joe Biden was apparently 10 points ahead of Trump at this point in his term, despite the fact that in May 2022, energy prices were skyrocketing and Biden was already showing his age. Unsurprisingly, Trump's decline in the poll has mostly been driven by inflation. As you might remember, Trump came to office accusing Biden of mishandling the economy and promising to bring prices down. This hasn't really happened though. While it's true that inflation did come down in the early months of his term, going from 3% in January 2025 to 2.3% in April, the lowest reading since February 2021, it refused to fall back down to the Federal Reserve's 2% target in 2025, and shot up in the first few months of 2026, reaching a recent high of 3.8% in April. This was largely driven by an increase in energy prices, with gas prices reaching a 4-year high of $4.50 a gallon. This is why Trump's net approval rating on the issue of inflation specifically has fallen to an unprecedented low of negative 40. Nor do things look likely to improve anytime soon. Most economic forecasts expect inflation to rise further in the coming months, and earlier this week, the US Producer Price Index, which basically tells you how much inflation producers are expecting and is generally considered a pretty good proxy for future inflation, came in at an eye-watering 6%, well above forecasts and the highest since December 2022. Furthermore, most of this is down to the war in Iran and the subsequent closure of the Strait of Hormuz, through which something like 20% of the world's oil and gas usually passes. Unfortunately for Trump, it's hard to see the strait reopening anytime soon, given that both sides are still essentially reiterating their original maximalist demands at each other. This became very apparent earlier in the week when Trump described Iran's response to the latest US proposal, where Iran apparently said that they wouldn't discuss the nuclear issue and demanded reparations, as, quote, unacceptable, and that the ceasefire between the two countries is now on life support. Given that neither side seems willing to make concessions at the moment, and with recent reports suggesting that Iran could withstand Trump's naval blockade for months, far longer than the Trump administration apparently expected, it's hard to see any normal traffic resuming anytime soon. Oil prices have obviously already gone up, and this has already done enormous harm to the GOP's electoral prospects. But things could get a lot worse, given that we're now just a couple of months away from exhausting global stockpiles, which have been drawn down at an unprecedented rate. Nonetheless, while the war in Iran has obviously made the problem more acute, inflation isn't a new problem for Trump, and he's been deep underwater on the issue since at least last April, when he announced his so-called Liberation Day tariffs. What was interesting about this, however, was that Trump's unpopularity didn't really translate to a meaningful increase in support for the Democrats. You can see this most clearly if you look at the so-called generic ballot, which essentially tells you what percentage of voters are planning on voting for Democrats versus Republicans at the next election. While Democrats have been ahead in the congressional ballot since April last year, they've struggled to really establish a solid lead, and in 2025, they were rarely more than 3 points ahead of the GOP. This might sound alright, but in large part thanks to Republican gerrymandering and the recent decision by the Virginia Supreme Court to strike down Democrats' attempts to counter gerrymander, Democrats would actually have to win the congressional ballot by an estimated 3 points in order to win the House, according to analysis by G. Elliott Morris, and even more to win the Senate. However, the most recent poll suggests that for some reason the Democrats have suddenly started surging in the congressional ballot. We got the first signs of this in a handful of polls last month, which suddenly showed double-digit leads for the Democrats. A Marquette Law School poll carried out in mid-April, for instance, put the Democrats 10 points ahead of the GOP, with 53 points to their 43. This was then followed by another Marist University poll and an Emerson poll, both carried out in late April, which both gave the Democrats a 10-point lead. And then early this week, Atlas Intel, which was the most accurate pollster in both the 2020 and 2024 presidential elections, came out with a shocking poll that gave them a massive 15-point lead in the congressional ballot, including, it should be said, a ridiculous 74-point lead with young voters between 18 and 29. Of course, this is just one poll, and the usual caveats apply, but it does look like the Democrat advantage in the congressional ballot is suddenly increasing. It's hard to say exactly why this is, but as always, inflation is almost definitely playing a role. Unfortunately for Trump, for reasons we mentioned earlier, it's hard to see things getting better anytime soon. That is, unless Trump wants to capitulate to Iran. Greenland. For decades, it's been viewed as little more than a giant ice sheet on the edge of the world. A massive ice fortress that most of us only ever saw from 30,000 feet on a flight to somewhere else. However, that ice is receding, and as it does, the world's superpowers are beginning to move in. At TLDR, we've spent almost 10 years explaining things from behind a desk, but some stories are too big for our studio. So to understand why this island, and the Arctic more generally, has suddenly become the most valuable real estate on Earth, we had to go there. As you'll soon discover though, this isn't just a political briefing hosted from the cold. We're hiking through the wild, discovering melting icebergs, and uncovering the rusting remnants of secret military projects abandoned in the snow.
I used to think I understood what cold was, but I was lying to myself.
Over 3 episodes, we're asking, what's the big deal with Greenland? From the scramble for rare earth minerals to the new battlefield for Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. We're camping out in the glaciers that are changing our climate and discovering the country caught in the middle of this global tug of war.
This is funny to you, Jet.
It will be funny to you in the future.
Hello.
Hello, deep there.
Jesus Christ.
There's the whale.
Right wheel.
Rather appropriately for the world's largest island, this is the biggest project we've ever taken on. A documentary about the beauty, power, and future of our planet. Coming this summer exclusively to TLDR Party members. If you're not a TLDR Party member already, you can sign up right now. Members not only get access to 2 long documentaries like this one, but they also get access to the audio versions of every article in our magazine Too Long, each narrated by the writers of those articles, allowing you to listen along to it all. You also get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen, access to our extra podcasts, The Last Move and The Last Word, our brand new news quiz.
That's very good.
As well as much more. Becoming a member costs £3.99 a month, but for the very best deal, you should grab the Too Long and TLDR Party bundle. That way you get both our quarterly magazine Too Long, as well as access to all of the benefits of TLDR Party for a very discounted rate. Plus, if you use code Greenland, we'll give you an extra £4 off your first bundle payment, making it basically the same price as a standalone subscription. Find out more and support the channel at toolong.news/party.